There we go. Welcome back, Washington County Democrats, to another interview in our Down the Ballot series with candidates for Oregon governor running for the Democratic nomination. We are here today with State Treasurer Tobias Read, who is one of the latest entrants into the race. Tobias, hi, how are you?
I'm well, thanks, Carl.
Oh, wonderful.
How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. So why don't you give the folks a little bit of background about yourself, because some of them are going to be new to Washington County Dems and our friends, and so maybe they weren't around when you were state treasurer. Could you give a little background about your work with Washington County?
I've been a Washington County Democrat for almost as long as I've been an Oregonian. I live in Beaverton and had the good fortune to serve as state representative from the Beaverton area for 10 years. So I remember the days when we had very small meetings in the Washington County Democrats, and I consider the Washington County Democrats some of my very earliest supporters, and really point to the Washington County Democrats as what we can do when we work together. I've had a great experience serving the legislature and serving the state treasurer, always focused on the long run, how we build our economy, protect our retirement, protect this beautiful place that we're lucky enough to live on. And I want to bring those lessons and those experiences to the governor's office.
Well, the first question that we ask all the candidates, since we are the Washington County Democrats, is why are you a Democrat?
I'm a Democrat because I think we can do more together than we can do individually. I have this conversation with our kids frequently about the kinds of things that make the sort of community that we want to live in. The soccer leagues, the libraries, the schools. Those are things that we can't do together, or we can't do apart. We have to do together. And I think Democrats are the party that have that in mind, that have the common interest in mind, and the ability to think about the long run. There's so much of our politics, our policy, even our biology that emphasizes the short term at the expense of the long run. And I think government and Democrats in particular have a really important role to play in thinking about what our life is going to be like decades, centuries into the future, and looking out for those folks who aren't as well represented. That's why I'm a Democrat.
And then the next question that, of course, every candidate is going to be honing their answers for is, why are you running for governor?
I think we need to have steady leadership in the state to get beyond the pandemic. That's what allows us to get back on the trajectory that we want to be on, the path that I just described, and looking out for the long run. But in order to do that, we have to get more people vaccinated. That's why I'm a strong proponent of vaccine mandates across the state, whether they're put in place by local governments or businesses or schools. It's why we need to add the COVID vaccine, once it's approved for younger people, to the existing list of 8 vaccines that are required for students. And this is really personal for me. I have 2 young kids, my wife and I, only one of whom is old enough to be vaccinated currently. And this is stuff we think about. It's stuff that I think every parent thinks about. That I think is the most important and most immediate issue. In the long run, I have a really simple approach to evaluating our progress. I want us to measure how we're doing as a state by how well our kids are doing. There are too many kids right now who are going to sleep hungry, who are dropping out of school, who've concluded that there aren't any opportunities left for them in the rural communities where they were raised. So we got a lot of work to do in that. And I think that starts with making sure that everyone has access to the pre-kindergarten, that we look at smart ways to extend the school year, make sure that people have access to apprenticeships and vocational training, and of course, investing in clean energy. So we're combating climate change, putting ourselves on a more resilient footing, and protecting this beautiful place where we live.
Yeah. Well, thank you. What's the most important issue? And you've highlighted a little bit about COVID already and our response to it. But what do you think is that the most overriding issue facing Oregonians in 2022, or is there something else?
Well, as we look at it right now, I don't think there's any way you can conclude anything else. My hope is that through 2022, we will be making progress on that front. So for the short term, yes, it is COVID. It is the barrier to everything else that I think we want to do. And so that is why we have to be really focused on getting more people vaccinated. It's the way out of the pandemic. It's the way we stop the spread and keep ourselves safe and give ourselves the space to make progress on these other things that we care about. as we make progress on that, I go back to that question of measuring our progress based on how well kids are doing. And I don't want to get distracted from that because I think it connects to everything else we want. How are kids' health status? What are their educational circumstances look like? Their achievements? What do their economic prospects look like? All of these things are good measures for how we're doing as a state and how we're going to do in the long.
Let's see. You've talked a little bit about your service in the legislature. And one of the questions that we've been asking everybody is, what experiences you have working with, and it's clear, if you've been a legislator, you've had some experience in that. So I guess what I want to be more interested in knowing is, you go into these legislative offices, if you're down in Salem, when we could be down in Salem, and you go into their offices and they have, framed legislation, the stuff that they're proud of that they put on the wall. What's some of the legislation that you were proud of and that you put on the wall?
It's a good question. I really value the experience that I had there. And I think I learned some really important things that resulted in a couple of pieces of legislation I'll point to in a second. I really valued the varied perspectives that I encountered, the backgrounds of most legislators come from different parts of this big geographic state with lots of different perspectives. And what I learned is how important it is to develop relationships that are based on trust. That's all we have in the Capitol. People need to know that they can count on you. You need to know that you can count on them. And when you're in that spot, you can create some really unusual combinations of people because you're focused on those values and you can trust people. For me, there are two bills in particular, two pieces of legislation that I'm especially proud of. One is bringing full-day kindergarten to Oregon. I got to carry that bill in the Oregon House. It was a really interesting process and an interesting discussion, but I think then as now, investments in kids are the very best investment that we can make. And I can say that now with added credibility as the state's chief investment officer. We look at the results of that change, what kinds of starts that kids get, the paths that they get on. That's a fantastic investment. I'm proud to have played a role in that. The other is putting us on the path that we've now achieved to be the first state in the country to operate an opt-out retirement plan for people in the private sector who don't have that opportunity otherwise. About half of people in Oregon, and the same number across the country, who are working without a way to save for retirement at work. And that puts them in an awkward spot of having to choose between often retiring into poverty or not retiring at all. And that's no choice, no way to live. So we changed that and established what we now call Oregon Saves, which is an opt-out plan. So it puts people on this path. They can step off if they want to, but it flips the norm and gets people on the path to financial security. We're about 4 years into this now. We have 115,000-ish people with funded retirement accounts. They've saved in excess of $135 million at this point. That's a number that goes up just about every week. And it really is gratifying to watch people who have often not been saving and not been part of the financial mainstream in the way that they want. Their faces light up when they say things like, I feel like I got a path now, I've got a future. So I put those two. I could go on for a while about other things I got to play a part in and be on teams about, but those are two that are top of my list.
Well, again, thank you for your legislative service and helping deliver those things to Oregonians. In regards to your current job, the state treasurer is not a traditional path to the governorship. I think maybe we've had about, half a dozen state treasurers in the last 50 years run for governor, and we got one in there. What part of your current job do you think best prepares you for the next job of being governor?
I think it's a matter of thinking about the long run. As treasurer, I have the role of being chief investment officer, and that gives me not only the opportunity, but the explicit responsibility to think about the implications of choices we make decades into the future. We're investing the Oregon Public Employee Retirement Fund, the pension fund, and the obligations that fund has go out decades. People who have not yet retired, people who have not yet started their public service. So we're not chasing quarterly returns. We're thinking about how to build a portfolio that's going to serve Oregonians for the very long run. And that is an attitude that I have long taken as a policymaker. I think that's what has made me a successful treasurer, and I think what will make me a successful governor. Thinking about the long run and bringing that credibility to discussions with people across the aisle, along with the reputation for being a trusted source of information, even for people I don't always agree with.
Talking a little bit more about, campaign life and how you got to this point of running for governor. Who would you say are either your political mentors or just mentors in life that sort of helped prepare you for this moment?
Well, of course, my parents, who made it really clear as I was a kid that I was benefiting from people who had come before me and invested in me, not me as an individual, but younger people. So I mentioned earlier on, I was thinking about this is a big part of why I'm a Democrat as well. The folks who made those libraries available and the soccer leagues happened in public schools and all that sort of thing. So my parents were really clear about that my responsibility to try to pay some of that back. They weren't expressly or deliberately political in that statement, but I found that really worked for me. And in the political world, I was raised in Idaho, so there are two great Idaho Democrats who may even be notable in Oregon, in Frank Church and C. Sanders. Frank Church was senator, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, and C. Sanders is probably as close as you get in Idaho to Tom McCall in Oregon. He was governor for 4 terms. He was Interior Secretary in President Carter's administration. And both of those guys, I think, did an amazing job of balancing strong convictions with an ability to connect with people of different backgrounds. Being an Idaho Democrat is no small thing. When I came to Oregon as a college student, I had the chance to work for a state legislator named Brian Johnston, who was a mediator by training and always very effective at creating solutions where people didn't see them. There were lots of people who disagreed with him, but almost no one who disliked him. I think that's a great model to follow. And of course, I look north to Washington State and have always admired the way Chris Gregoire governed with charm, but a steely resolve and a really strong backbone. So those are people that occur to me right off the bat.
I guess the thing about running a campaign is you start to meet a lot of people, and they want to support your campaign. Who have been some of the notable people that have started supporting your campaign since you announced?
I'm pleased to have support from a range of people. Senator Lee Beyer, Senator James Manning, former Representative Greg McPherson, and former Representative Margaret Doherty, former County Commissioner Jules Bailey, Michael Alexander of the Urban League, range of people across the state representing teachers and nurses and firefighters and public servants of all sorts. I think what is most unifying about them are people who think about the long run, who share my desire to measure our progress based on how well our kids are doing.
Well, I think we're going to end with this question for this part of the interview. What's an interesting fact about yourself that voters would be surprised to learn about you?
I think we've sort of let the cat out of the bag in this conversation a little bit already. I was raised in Idaho as a Democrat, and if I thought the early meetings that I attended of the Washington County Democrats were small, those are huge compared to Ada County in Idaho and even Idaho State Democratic Party events in some cases. That's probably a little unkind to Idaho Democrats, but it's not exactly friendly territory.
Yeah.
So I think that has been a really good lesson for me in 2 important ways. One, to have my convictions tested in territory that wasn't always hospitable. And the other is in figuring out how to work with people of different backgrounds and different philosophies. This is not something I talk about a lot in Oregon, but it gives me really solid grounding in the values and priorities as Democrats, and I think continues to serve me really well.
Yeah. Well, we've got some viewer questions that have come in from Washington County activists. Great. And we'll go through a couple. We won't do them all, but we'll go through a couple of them that folks are, the voters who are going to be voting in this primary These are the things they're curious about.
Sure.
So our first question comes from Lindsay W., and she wanted to know what you thought of timber unity.
Lindsay, it's a good question. I can't find a lot that I agree with Timber Unity on in terms of their politics, or what I would describe as a fairly narrow and short-term orientation with respect to policy questions. But I do think it's important also for us to recognize or acknowledge that the rise of Timber Unity, I think, represents a feeling of frustration on people who've gone that route. Perhaps the feeling that state government isn't listening to them, that they don't have an outlet or a way to make their priorities felt. So I think it's really important for us to approach conversations with folks who ally with Timber Unity with that frame in mind. They've come in lots of cases to different policy conclusions, but they're Oregonians, they're our neighbors, our relations, they're people with whom we need to find some alignment on our long-term goals. And I think they're there. All of us want our families and our kids to be healthy and happy and nearby and have a brighter future. So I think that's the place to start, which will allow for, I think, a better discussion of the policies where we might differ.
And you know, we've had a lot of different policy disagreements the last couple of years in the legislature, and it's led to some walkouts, some very notable walkouts. And Maureen B. from Rock Creek would like to know, how can we advance our policy goals and avoid costly legislative walkouts?
I don't think anybody should be happy about walkouts, and I don't think we should unilaterally lay down our priorities for the mere goal of avoiding them. But I do think when they happen, we have to look in the mirror to some extent and figure out what we can do to avoid creating a situation where those who are walking out feel like they don't have any other option. From my perspective, a lot of that has to do with listening and having the humility to listen to other perspectives, even those we really dislike. Because by doing that, I think we accumulate goodwill, we accumulate trust, so that when we get to that point where we come to different conclusions, it's not so catastrophic as to cause people on the other side to feel like they have to leave. There's room for that, and there's room for healthy disagreement and vigorous debate, as we've seen in Oregon history, without having to shut down the entire process. We need to make sure that people feel like their voices are heard, even if the outcome is not what they like.
Mm-hmm. One of the issues that Jennifer L. would like to talk about, and she's from Tigard. We've gotten a lot of news about this, and it's been on a lot of people's minds. Is what ideas do you have to address houselessness and the lack of affordable housing? And she writes, particularly for senior citizens.
Well, the first thing I think is to acknowledge that what we are doing is not working and not working fast enough. As I travel around the state, I feel and see this in lots of different places. It's tangible, it's visceral, and it's searing. It's not just a Portland problem. It exists in different flavors across the state. So I think we have to acknowledge that first. And then I tend to think about this in short and long-term frames. In the long term, we have to be building more housing. We have to be putting different types of housing in different places to meet different circumstances. In the short term, we have to recognize that we have to do a better job with the dollars we have. It's not a short term versus long term. It's a both and approach, where people who are experiencing episodic homelessness are acknowledged to have a different set of challenges than those who are chronically homeless. We need to take on the questions of addiction and mental health in a way that allows people to be on the path towards housing. And let's recognize an important aspect of this that sometimes gets short shrift. There's about 4% of kids who are homeless. So it's about 1 in every classroom in really rough terms. So if nothing else, an investment in helping kids have a solid place to live is going to put them on a much better path to the educational future that we want for them.
So this is a question from Tom M. in Tigard, and it's probably something, a question you get a lot about being in the position of state treasurer. What measures do you support to contain and reduce the PERS unfunded liability?
It's a good question. Let's start by defining what the unfunded liability really is. It's a measure of the gap between what we could pay in cash today and what we will ultimately owe. It's a bit like asking someone who has a mortgage whether they could pay off their mortgage in cash today. For most people, the answer to that question is no. Now, that's not to dismiss it, but it is to suggest that we manage it as a state, much like an individual person or family manages their mortgage, which is in fact an unfunded liability for most people. So we don't have to pay it immediately. We manage it over time. And in the Treasury, that's our role, to generate returns. And that unfunded liability fluctuates over time based on assumptions that we make about the system, based on returns that we get in the market, based on what's happening in the world economy. So we got to pay attention to that, but we also got to have our eye on the long run. And it's notable to me that I think when we talk about PERS, what we're really talking about is what does it cost to hire a public servant? Again, a teacher, a firefighter, a caseworker, a foster care caseworker, any of these kinds of things, this becomes relevant. And we choose, I think, to focus a lot of our discussion and mental energy on the component of that total compensation that has the least flexibility. The Supreme Court and other courts have made it really clear that the range of things that you could do around PERS is really narrow. Within that range, there's not that much that makes any kind of a significant difference in terms of finances. But I understand the question, and I think we can do more if we talk about another major component of total compensation, which is healthcare. There's a lot more flexibility and a lot more possibility if we think about how we can deliver healthcare to public servants more efficiently and less expensively.
Just sort of a side to this, because this is a really good conversation of what a lot of folks get frustrated about when they, are asked about PERS. Do you think Republicans purposely, use the PERS issue as just sort of like a wedge issue with people? Like they know the right answer, but them acknowledging the right answer takes away, a battle point in the campaign for them.
Well, it's a good question, Carl, but I always object, as I'm sure you do, when someone says, well, Democrats think X. I'm not naive enough to think that I speak for every Democrat, so I'm not going to say that every Republican does that. PERS is an enormously complicated question. I know a lot more about it now than I did before I was treasurer. So I will just say that I think there is opportunity to try to have a good conversation with people where we dismiss the political machinations around it. Someone I used to work for would say sometimes, this is not politics, it's not Republicans and Democrats, this is arithmetic. And I think that applies here as well.
Yeah. So we had another question come in from Carol G. in Tualatin, and this is about state government management. She would like to know, how do we proactively manage our state government to avoid the meltdowns like that we've seen in the unemployment department or the rollout of the Affordable Care Act?
I think I know which Carol G this is, and I'm not surprised that she asked a good question here. This is not a particularly exciting or a headline driving answer, but it's a matter of making the investments and doing the maintenance when you don't need it. It's hard to cut a ribbon on the replacement of an aging infrastructure system, whether that's physical or technical or technological in this case. But we knew that the unemployment administration system was aging. We had this conversation, but we couldn't muster the support or the administrative confidence to undertake that in a way that it got done in time. So I think this is a lesson that I've learned as a legislator, as treasurer. We put it into place within our own physical plant at Treasury, thinking about what happens after an earthquake, for example, and building a truly resilient building for that purpose. That's something I'll bring to the governor's office, looking ahead, being focused on those things that are going to put us in a more resilient position, even when they're not exciting, because we've seen what ignoring that kind of basic infrastructure leads to.
Well, Mr. Treasurer, thank you for your time. Is there a final thought, comment you would like to share with the Washington County Democrats and our friends watching this afternoon?
Well, I really appreciate the strong base you've given me over the years. Washington County is home, and it feels really nice to connect with people. It's going to be an exciting adventure through this campaign, and I just encourage people to be involved and remember that I think the best way to evaluate our progress as a state is how our kids are doing.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Treasurer Read.
Thank you, Carl.